Hi, everybody. Today is the 75th anniversary of one of the most important documents of the history of the Cold War after World War II. And that, of course, is the long telegram sent by George F. Kennan from the US Embassy in Moscow. And Kennan at the time was the acting ambassador, and he transmitted the longest telegram in the history of the State Department up to that time. He could not send it as an email attachment. That wasn't an option then. And of course, that story is well known to generations of historians and involuntarily to their students who know that it had a crucial impact on the American government, which at that point was getting somewhat exasperated by the difficulty of dealing with the Soviet Union, its former ally, against the Axis in World War II. And Kennan tried to clarify what he saw as the most serious challenge to US foreign policy it had ever faced. And he depicted the Soviet Union as a long-term, very serious adversary, combining various geopolitical strengths resting on the vast resources of the Soviet Union and Russia, as well as the ideological apparatus of a worldwide constellation of communist parties that were controlled by the Kremlin. Now, I am a professor of history and international affairs at George Washington University, but more importantly, I'm the former director of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project. And the comparative advantage of QUIP, as we like to call it, is to get beyond the American-centric view of the Cold War, how it looked from Washington, which dominated historical accounts of Cold War history for decades until after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And what QUIP tries to do is to offer the evidence and perspectives of the other sides, and most importantly, the Soviet or Russian side of Cold War history. And today, we are very lucky to have an incredibly distinguished gathering of the top experts on the Cold War from the Soviet bloc and communist perspective. And let me briefly introduce them. There is Vladimir Pechatnov, who I actually first met about 32 years ago at an event that George Kennan actually attended. Vladimir is an esteemed scholar of Cold War history. He's based at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. He has published widely on Cold War history, including books about Stalin, Roosevelt, and Truman, as well as co-editing the correspondence of Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. His presentation will go first. Then we will have his protege back in the last decade of the Cold War at the Institute of the, for the Study of the USA and Canada of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, Vladislav Zubak, who is currently a professor of history at the London School of Economics. Then we will go to Svetlana Savranskaya, who also remembers the Soviet Union and the Cold War, although she is not as senior as the two Vlads. She is the senior analyst on Russian and Soviet affairs at the National Security Archive, based at George Washington University, which is, despite his name, a non-governmental research institute that focuses on using the Freedom of Information Act and other pressure to get governments to release their sources. And Svetlana has published widely on Cold War history from beginning to end and co-edited prize-winning collections of documents on Cold War history, including US-Soviet summits. Then we will have Mark Kramer from Harvard. He is the director of the Harvard Project on Cold War Studies and editor of the Journal of Cold War Studies, and he is based at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. And then finally, last but not least, we will have Sergei Radchenko, who is a phenomenal Cold War historian. He's based at Cardiff University in Wales. He has published books on the Sino-Soviet split, Two Suns in the Heavens, and also on Soviet relations with Asia near the end of the Cold War, Unwanted Visionaries, and has a broad Cold War history forthcoming. So without further ado, to give a chance to have our panelists evaluate the long telegram however they wish and its meaning for Cold War history and beyond, let me first turn to Vladimir.
Thank you, Jim, for the introduction. When I teach at my school the course on foreign policy, I always give the long telegram as one of the canonical texts. But this time I've read it again for our session and saw, became even more convinced than before, that it's of course a very elaborate and skillful and very insightful piece of work. But at the same time, I think George Kennan, with all due respect for the old man, and he was really great as a statesman and as a strategist, I think he, in this particular document, he simplified and exaggerated the Soviet menace and the Soviet Union itself, describing it as an existential threat, an inhuman force pathologically bent on destroying the Western world. So in this way, Kennan made things more clear than the truth, as Dean Acheson used to say.
Yes.
But this was exactly what made this document so useful and so effective in its impact on the policymakers in Washington. Because what Kennan did with this cable was to provide a conceptual alternative to the view of the Soviet Union and the sources of Soviet conduct, which failed during World War II. I would remind that Dan Ergen, in his old book, mentioned this, called this Yalta and Riga axioms. Mm-hmm. Yalta was essentially what Roosevelt and his circle were doing during the war, treating the Soviet Union as another great power with legitimate geopolitical and security interests, which is evolving, which with the time, with the proper treatment from the West, can be integrated into the world family of nations, as FDR used to say, that the Soviet Union is not hopeless. It's capable of evolving given the right policy from the West. So that was an optimistic alternative. Kennan was fighting this for a long time, particularly after he came back to Moscow in summer of 44. But he didn't have an audience in Washington initially. He wrote a letter to Bolin about Yalta time. Bolin wouldn't listen to him. Then he talked to Harry Hopkins during his last visit to Moscow in June 45. And Hopkins said, "I respect your views, but I can't share them." But then finally, by the early 46, the time has arrived. And the timing was very important. And what Kennan did was essentially to challenge the old assumptions, the Yalta axioms, and to present an alternative to this, an alternative diagnosis of the Soviet system, of the sources of the Soviet conduct, and an outline of what the United States should do to counter this threat. And there were three main points of revision, which were, I think, achieved with this document. First of all, the Soviet system was pictured as an inherently aggressive, instead of this image of a rational great power with legitimate security interests. Actually, in Kennan's telegram, that kind of a system should not have any legitimate interests at all. I mean, illegitimate totalitarian system is not entitled to having rational, essential security interests. Second point was that the Soviet system was seen as, Soviet conduct was seen as immutable, as incurable. Whatever the West would do, the Soviets would remain the same. That was a contrast to the former assumption of elasticity of Soviet motives, that the Soviet Union would react differently to different Western policies. And finally, as a result of this diagnosis, the ultimate goal was seen not in integrating that peculiar state into the family of nations, but rather of isolating and containing it to the point where the system would break up. So we see this almost diametrical differences between the two approaches. And I think that Svetlana may want to talk about how those two visions of not only the Soviet Union, but also of Russia are playing out these days. I mean, now we're still working along with those two paradigms, two visions of Russia and its sources of its behavior still. Are we still with, and getting back to perhaps to Riga's axioms about Russia? So this is not a question about history. That's my basic point to begin with, but no, we don't have much time. So let me yield to other speakers, and then perhaps we'll have a discussion on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir, for those provocative remarks. It's hard to resist commenting on them myself. Just for the audience, I just want to point out that the book that Vladimir referred to that has the Riga axioms and the Munich axioms, that's Daniel Yergin's Shattered Peace, which came out so long ago that I even remember reading it in college, which was a long time ago.
77, yeah, I think 77.
Exactly, and I went to college the next year, so it's a classic. Let me now turn to the other Vladislav Zubak.
Oh, right. Thank you so much, Jim. And you know, I'm honored to follow in the footsteps of Vladimir, who's indeed my teacher. So let me continue in this provocative fashion, simply because, you know, I'm another Russian who grew up in the shadow of the U.S. containment, and later on moved to the West. Let me start with John Lewis Gaddis, another well-known historian of the Cold War, who is, in his brilliant biography of Kennan, compared the long telegram with an X-ray. It was, he wrote, the geopolitical equivalent of medical X-ray to yield at first clarity, then comprehension, and finally a course of treatment. The end of quotation. So the containment of the Soviet Union, according to Gaddis, was a fantastic treatment. It ultimately, of course, granted the United States its victory in the Cold War, or so the triumphalist version of this history goes. Let me argue that the long telegram and its impact can be even better described by another metaphor from biology and medicine. It is quite topical today. Kennan compared communist totalitarianism to a pernicious virus that is always present in body politic, dangerous only when powers of resistance are weakened. It is this metaphor of a virus that I want to discuss today. My brief talk is influenced by the writing of another famous Cold War historian, Frank Costigliola. In my view, the virus metaphor fits both for the way the long telegram was written, its immediate huge impact, and its lasting power. First, what do we know about virus? It's a great unknown. It's ubiquitous and it scares everyone. You can read and reread the long telegram many times, as I did, to prepare for my classes, for instance, and you still fail to understand the nature of the Soviet communist threat. This is why, by the way, Cold War historians have to add so much background for their students to explain the document. So Kennan's image of a threat in his long telegram was all the more menacing because it was impersonal. Kennan did not even mention Stalin once. Let's suppose he had written in his telegram, "Oh, Stalin is a bloody and paranoid tyrant, aging tyrant." Then, of course, the disease would become obvious and therefore not ubiquitous. Kennan also could have put communism in the center, but then it would have become familiar because since the 20s, the Americans had been told from many corners about atheistic, death-rejecting, family-trampling, troublemaking Bolshevik regime. Kennan's image of threat was also strikingly different from how Churchill viewed it and presented in his Fulton speech. Churchill, after all, recognized that Russian friends could be stopped by the Anglo-American alliance. There's nothing they admire so much as strength. That's from Churchill. In his long telegram, Kennan evoked a different image, and in his notes, he extrapolated on it. Fanatical, carnivorous beast, impervious to reason. The image of the virus is here. Second, about the virus metaphor, nobody knows how to deal with the virus. The danger of pandemic is always absolute and universal. It cannot be specified and localized. At this point, I would only quote another excellent historian, Melvin Leffler. The long telegram had no discussions of US interests, no enumeration of US priorities, no real prescriptions. Gaddis writes, Americans could secure their interests by staying reasonable. This is what Kennan advised them, a strangely comforting tautology. And of course, immediately, as we know, critics like Walter Lippmann said that Kennan's containment was merely a slogan. It could not be a grand strategy. Kennan responded to this criticism, trying to localize the threat, yet he quickly got defeated by his own metaphor. Ultimately, Paul Nitze and then John Foster Dulles returned to an original, universal metaphor of containment. Finally, and here I slightly disagree with Vladimir, I think in the long telegram, the threat or the virus is subject to mutation. One really cannot fully defeat it. The prescription for treatment of vague disease could only be as vague, open-ended, and unclear as the disease itself. So containment provided was a good tool of fear management. Containment provided a huge space for different factions and forces inside American domestic politics and polity to assert themselves. Containment also provided an ample room of choices between an all-out war and doing nothing. In the end, as I already said, the maximalist version of containment prevailed. Total threat should be met by total efforts and measures, just as any pandemic requires. Psychological mobilization matched totalitarian scale. Anybody who was against containment automatically were declared un-American, the enemy of freedom and democracy. So in the end, containment became a dogma. One may even argue that containment itself became a sort of virus. It got so well attached to American body politics. So many of American groups of interests got adjusted to it and hoisted it on its flag. It cannot be extracted from American politics and foreign policy to this day. In fact, it forms a powerful duo with another parasite word, appeasement. These two words provide all-size-fits-all ideology for the United States and its allies. Of course, during the Cold War, it was an excellent pair of words. It mobilized majority and silenced critics. Historian Fred Loggeval calls containment a unique and exceptional approach to foreign policy. No negotiations. And how can you negotiate with the virus? I would end with this.
Okay, thank you, Vlad. You raise a lot of important questions, including about current politics in the United States, but also the whole story of how George Kennan lost control of containment very quickly after the long telegram and the X article a year later, and was not very happy with how it would later evolve. But let's now turn to Svetlana Savranskaya. Sveta.
Thank you, Jim. It is a pleasure to be in this company of old friends and teachers. And thank you for raising my seniority by putting me So I was at Moscow State University during the time when perestroika began. And I was studying the United States. And I have to say that pretty much in every Soviet publication about the United States, a person had to mention Kennan and his long telegram. And I remember in 1988, already we read, I can't say definitely that we read the entire document, but we definitely read excerpts. We were expected to criticize them, of course, but along with criticizing, it was very thought-provoking, even the excerpts, probably the excerpts that we read. So the long telegram had quite an impact on the Soviet thinking. Soviet thinking maybe about the United States and about how the United States sees the Soviet Union. And I would like specifically to talk about the end of the Cold War and any relevance that it has today. And I would like to make a brief comment on first Vlad's metaphor of a virus. This is a very interesting metaphor. So in my own reading of the long telegram, which I just reread last night, to me, it seems like it's a contradictory document, and maybe it is conditioned by my view of Kennan as somebody who does understand the Russian people and the Russian history very well. I read a lot of Kennan's publications before his history of the Russian Revolution and US-Russian relations. So I always felt that Kennan does get the Russian history and the Soviet regime. However, this particular document is contradictory in the way that first it describes the Soviet system as this beastly, really bloodthirsty system in very emotional terms. It's a diplomatic cable, but it uses a very emotional language. So it describes it as a virus, okay, but in the end, the answer to how to deal with the virus, I think we could use another metaphor and to say, well, the answer is really to contain this virus, we have to strengthen our immune system. We really have to strengthen our own domestic democratic principles, and that's how we protect ourselves from this virus. So I think that and the idea that the Soviet system does not to be pushed from the outside, it will fall down on its own because it's essentially a rotten system that does not have deep popular support. I think that aspect of the long telegram was very attractive to the Soviet reformers around Gorbachev. I know that Chernayev mentioned long telegram, actually many times in conversations that I had with him. And Gorbachev certainly himself was aware of that. He met Kennan once in 1987 when Gorbachev was in Washington for the signing of the INF Treaty. And he said, Mr. Kennan, we in our country believe that a man may be a friend of another country and remain at the same time a loyal and devoted citizen of his own. And that is the way we view you. So essentially, Gorbachev says, we view you as a friend of our country. And that's exactly how I met Kennan. I never met him personally, but I met him as a thinker through his work as a friend of Russia and a friend of the reform in the Soviet Union. And his view was actually in demand in this new reforming Soviet Union in the end of the 80s. There's another document that I would like to cite, which is quite amazing because it starts with the discussion of the long telegram. And that's a meeting between Alexander Yakovlev and Kennan in October 1990. So Kennan comes to Moscow after he goes to Berlin to participate in the celebrations of unification of Germany. And he meets with Yakovlev. He doesn't get to meet with Gorbachev because Gorbachev is too busy at that time in discussions of the Persian Gulf conflict. But they start the conversation with the discussion of the long telegram. And Yakovlev says, just from the outset, essentially, of course, I know your long telegram and your X article very well. And I have to admit my sins, I criticized it. But I also always thought that it contains a lot of truth about our country. And Kennan kind of apologizes back to Yakovlev saying, yes, you know, but the truths are mainly at the end of the article. And I found this really important. This is kind of how I saw this two parts of this article. First, very militaristic, I would say, setting out the containment. But in the end, the article is, the telegram is not calling for an outright crusade against the Soviet Union. And of course, then, as Jim, you pointed out, Kennan, essentially for the rest of his life, he tried to fight for the kind of more peaceful interpretation of containment. And I would say that Kennan actually remained very relevant to Russia in the 1990s as Russia was trying to find the models to follow, as it was trying to kind of try on different clothes from the West, from its own past, played with nationalism. And here I would like to refer to another great historian, Vladimir Pechatnov, and his article, his essay on the Kennan's biography by John Gaddis in Mark's Journal, where Vladimir Pechatnov talks about how in his later work, especially in the article in 1951, but then also in the article in 1990 in Foreign Affairs, Kennan cautions his audience from being too optimistic about the change in the Soviet Union or in 1990 in Russia, right? That Americans should not expect that suddenly, if the system falls, the new system that will come in will be a liberal democratic system looking just like an American system. And I think this is where his even bigger relevance is for today. And I would like to, in the end, mention something about today and long telegram's relevance for today. I think that more and more, when we look at what's happening in Russia, we see the echo of this particular paragraph, and Pete could probably bring it up on the screen. This paragraph is very widely cited about the insecurity and mistrust of foreigners. At bottom of Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. I'm not going to quote the entire paragraph, but this instinctive kind of conspiratorial view, expectation of threat from the abroad, almost a need for an external enemy, which we know is not unique only to Russia, but you see more and more of that. And I will end with the response to Vladimir Pechatnov's question, whether there are these two schizophrenic views of Russia in the United States right now, whether the system is just, you know, inherently evil and unchangeable, or system can change. Unfortunately, more and more talking to people in academic circles, less so in academic circles, but in Washington, you see that view emerging. I would not say that it dominates the discussion, when you see more mistrust of Russia, more conspiratorial view of Russia, certainly the view that aligns better with the first part of Long Telegram. And it is gaining strength right now. I would agree with that, but I would not say that it is dominant. There are still a lot of people who believe that building our own immune system would protect us from the ideas of nationalism, totalitarianism, and return to the Cold War. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sveta. Let me just make a couple of quick points of reference for the audience. One is Sveta referred to Kennan's emotionalism, and that, of course, suggests the work of a historian that Vladimir, and I think both Vlads might have mentioned, Frank Castigliola has stressed the importance of emotion in US foreign policy. He not only edited Kennan's diaries, which were published several years, but I believe is near completion of his own biography of Kennan, which should be coming out in the near future and should be perhaps the most important biography since John Lewis Gaddis's. So that's one thing. Second, in terms of that fascinating meeting with Kennan in 1990, of course, by then, even though he had made his name as the author of the Long Telegram and the X article, he had become well known as a dissident to his own policy, most famously for opposing the military escalation in the Vietnam War in 1966, but also, and this is something true throughout his later career, his passionate opposition to the nuclear arms race. And he had become a very important voice in that, both secretly in opposing the hydrogen bomb in 1949-50, but also opposing Ronald Reagan's nuclear policies in the first half of the 1980s, which I think endeared him quite a bit to the Soviet Union at that point. Let me turn now to Mark Kramer.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Somehow I see less consistency to Kennan's views, I think, than Jim just implied. That is, Kennan generally supported policies when people were listening to him, and when he felt he was being ignored or wasn't in the government anymore, he tended to oppose almost anything that was done. I'm not sure that I see consistency of principle there, but in any case, let me make a few comments about the Long Telegram. I'm going to be, Vlad alluded to Churchill's speech, the Sinews of Peace speech that Churchill gave less than 2 weeks later. That speech is illuminating to look at. Churchill, I am certain, had not seen the Long Telegram. And these were documents composed entirely independently of each other. But it is instructive to compare them, because Churchill's speech, in my view, is in some respects more insightful about the Soviet Union than Kennan's is, even though Churchill was not an expert on Russia or the Soviet Union. In any case, the one striking omission in the Long Telegram is any discussion or even really any mention of the devastating impact that the war had on the Soviet Union. And this goes back to this question of interest. But whereas Churchill does bring that up at some length, for example, let me just quote here that Churchill refers to, that he says, "I have a strong admiration and regard for the valiant Russian people and for my wartime comrade, Marshal Stalin." He then goes on to express his desire to forge lasting friendships. "We understand the Russian need to be secure on her western frontiers by the removal of all possibility of German aggression." So the impact of the war is very much on Churchill's mind, even though he is warning about that the Iron Curtain has fallen over Europe, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But still, that the absence of that in the long telegram, I just regard as quite remarkable. Another point would be that, again, maybe in part because my ancestors came from, my family came from Latvia, but the long telegram equates the Soviet Union and Russia. Russia and Soviet Union or USSR are used interchangeably. Russians are equated with the Soviet population. There is one fleeting mention of Azerbaijan and Armenia and Turkmenistan, but it treats them as foreign countries almost. That essentially Russia is brought in here. There's no mention of Ukraine, for example, or any notion that the multi-ethnic composition of the Soviet Union was somehow a potential weakness or would have any effect on the long-term stability of Soviet Union. By contrast, Churchill, again in his sinews of speech, it's a difficult one to pronounce, does express sympathy for what he doesn't refer to them by name, doesn't identify them, but does discuss the peoples of the Soviet Union, even if he doesn't mention who they are. So another point, and here, just to slightly qualify what Vlad mentioned, is Stalin is mentioned in the long telegram, but only a few times, and there's no real analysis of Stalin per se. However, if anything, it illustrates that Kennan's understanding of the Soviet system was a little bit lacking here. I quote from the long telegram. He said, "There is good reason to suspect that this government is actually a conspiracy within a conspiracy. And I, for one, am reluctant to believe that Stalin himself receives anything like an objective picture of the outside world." Implies that there is somehow that Stalin isn't the dominant force in Soviet politics. Now, whether he received an accurate or objective picture of the outside world clearly is a different matter, but it implies that Stalin is somehow the captive of forces beyond his control, which I think, at least what we know now about the Soviet Union, is totally divorced from the reality at the time, and again reflects the near absence of Stalin in the long telegram. The fourth point would be about the long telegram does refer in considerable detail to colonialism and to dependent peoples, is a reference, and Kennan implies that Soviet challenges to colonialism and support for forces in colonial holdings would be a major threat to the West. And at least someone reading the long telegram, regardless of what Kennan's subsequent stance was on the Vietnam War, would support efforts to hold on to colonial possessions and to oppose what Soviet Union, but not only Soviet Union, were doing by way of supporting the different struggles or the armed uprisings against colonial powers. So again, that's an illustration of how Kennan's own words, which he presumably should have been careful about, could be cited by those who later on had very different views, regardless of what Kennan's view was in 1946. Someone reading the long telegram could certainly interpret it in a way that to really take a strong stance in support of colonialism against armed movements. Another point would be the role of ideology here, that the long telegram depicts it in the Soviet Union as only a fig leaf, and had lost all its animating force. But again, here I think it really understates the extent to which the anti-Western thrust of Soviet ideology was quite widely shared, at least in what became the Third World. And that the Soviet Union under Stalin, but also under subsequent leaders, shared that desire to undercut Western dominance. And that was very much a part of Soviet ideology. It's one of the reasons that Marxism, Leninism did have a considerable appeal beyond just communist parties, that there were, especially in the Third World, but also in many parts of the left in the West as well. And then, do I still have a bit of time, Jim? If so, then let me just come back to this question of comparing the Churchill's speech in Fulton with the long telegram. Is that Churchill talked in considerable detail about Europe then, whereas Europe, does figure a bit in the long telegram, but it's much more clearly driven by what had just happened in Iran and Turkey, and there isn't really much of a mention about what was going on. There are a couple of references, say, to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, but beyond that, there isn't really a sense that Soviet Union was beginning to assert a much greater preponderance in Eastern Europe. And whatever the reason for omitting that was, it does strike me that, at least in the context of the time, that what was going on in Europe was very much driving the acceptance of the long telegram, even though Kennan really didn't discuss it much at any length. That Churchill, in touching on that, really struck a chord with people, and that probably deepened the acceptance of the long telegram, because many of those who read the long telegram did so after Churchill's speech. And then final point that I'll make, it has to do with this, the question of how Kennan's later disavowals of containment have to do with what he accepted at the time. It is true that Kennan, in his memoirs and in many public statements later on, did disavow it, but certainly as late as the time that the U.S. covert operations were being put together, Kennan was really the driving force behind that and pushing it, even over the reluctance of the CIA and others. So to the extent that he disavows the way containment worked out, I mean, I think he should look in the mirror and probably castigate himself if he does genuinely believe that, or did genuinely believe that. Final quick comment is, if you think about the long telegram, Churchill speech, and also the X article as kind of the bookend on at the beginning of the Cold War, you can look on the bookend at the end of it with, say, Frank Fukuyama's end of history speech. And if you compare those, because Fukuyama's article, not speech, his article, that article is a very meticulous Hegelian analysis of whether the end of history had been reached. And it really stands in quite stark contrast, I think, to the starker bookend at the beginning of the Cold War, where it was laid out in much starker, in some ways, much more simplistic terms. It doesn't mean, again, that one is better than the other, because the audience for the first were policymakers, and they tend to want a starker analysis. But even though Fukuyama has often been criticized for his end of history article, I think he laid it out in a way that, at least for an academic audience, is easier one to come back to and to try to understand where it was right and where it was wrong.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Couple of quick comments. Since you have talked about Churchill's speech and other parts of the context of the long telegram, one thing that often doesn't get mentioned, but I think is very important, is the Guzenko case in Canada was revealed publicly literally a couple of days before Kennan composed his long telegram. And the revelations that the Soviets had been spying on the Manhattan Project also pushed US public opinion in that direction. Finally, since you brought it up, I certainly will not argue that Kennan was consistent. He contradicted himself constantly. The only thing I will argue is even when he took opposite sides of positions, he was always eloquent and compelling on all sides. So it was great to read him. Okay, Sergey.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for having me here. Really great honor and pleasure to go after such an esteemed panel of historians, several generations as well of Russian historians. I see myself as sort of the younger generation, I suppose. I was only in '89, I was only 9 years old when the Cold War ended. So, you know, I have a slightly different perspective, I think, conditioned by my own experience, my formative experience with Russia in the 1990s, you know, Russia of chaos and Russia of great cynicism, which I think made me something of a cynical person. Is that a bad thing? I guess it's a bad thing, you know. So in this sense, when I read Kennan's long telegram, I could relate to a lot of things where he talked about cynical Soviet power. I could kind of relate to that because, you know, this affected my own background as well. My upbringing in Russia in the 1990s, it was as the Soviet Union was, well, on the ruins of the Soviet Union. I've got a really, you know, I think most important points have already been mentioned. So I'll just briefly speak about some general impressions here. Here's my main difficulty when, as a historian, I have to deal with Stalin. And that is, I know that Stalin was a hideous monstrosity. Yeah, I know that. I believe that very firmly. It's just something that is so patently clear to anyone who's ever worked on anything, you know, on anything related to Stalin. They'll just see just what kind of a horrible person, horrible individual he was. You know, but we have, as historians, we have a problem compared to Kennan. Kennan, I think, could hate Stalin. He could see Stalin for the hideous monstrosity that he was, and be fine with this. Whereas as historians, we're in a more difficult position because we also have to explain Stalin's behavior by evaluating Stalin's or Soviet take on certain events in a way that Kennan never could or never had to. You know, we know, for example, from archival evidence that Stalin had his claims that he felt were justified. You know, you could argue on the basis of the archival evidence that he had limited aims, for example, and that he was not going to overtake the entire world, which of course fed into this whole strand of historiography, arguing that perhaps there was a possibility for a post-Second World War consensus in Europe that somehow just did not work out, but that Stalin actually had limited aims. But I find it difficult to do that. You know, I find this difficult in class when I have to justify Stalin because I know that he was a horrible person and I know that he was a monster. And then I have to say, well, actually, you know, it's a reasonable thing. And look, when in London at the Conference of Foreign Ministers in September 1945, you know, when James Burns pushed on Molotov and sort of flashed the atomic bomb in his pocket, etc., you know, what would be my reaction as if I were there? And I was like, well, my reaction would be I would also push back. Look, it's reasonable, but I'm not Stalin. I'm not Stalin. Yeah, so it's very difficult. You see, I have moral anguish every time that I have to deal with Soviet leadership, because as much as I try to relate to their dilemmas, to their difficulties, etc., I also find their aims deeply unappealing, and I struggle with that as a historian. And I wonder, you know, what my esteemed colleagues think of that maybe they've been able to overcome the struggle. I never have been able to do that. You know, I look at other Soviet leaders. I look at Khrushchev. I try to sympathize with Khrushchev. I've been reading, working in Brezhnev in recent months. And, you know, you read so much Brezhnev, you think, well, actually Brezhnev it seems like he was a pretty nice guy. And then you come across him trying to justify the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And then you think, oh, what a bastard. You know, it's very difficult. It becomes very difficult at that point. Why am I talking about that? Oh, by the way, that connects to that question of Kennan and his vision, latter-day Kennan, as it were, his vision of cooperation with the Soviet Union. In the Brezhnev documents, there's a wonderful file which is a reaction. So Kennan, in the early 1980s, made this proposal to have nuclear arsenals. Let's have nuclear arsenals. What a great idea. So Brezhnev's foreign policy advisor, Alexander Agentov, wrote Brezhnev a memo saying, oh, look what Kennan is saying, you know, how about we support this idea? Because it may be propaganda, but at least, you know, if it works out, we just stand to win in this, you know, propaganda war. And Brezhnev forwarded that to the Politburo. He was very sick and old at that point, and he received the joint memorandum from Andropov, Gromyko, and Ustinov, who said, under no circumstances are we to endorse this crazy idea because, look, this will put America in a more advantageous position in terms of, you know, their nuclear arsenal. So, in other words, even if Kennan was trying to peddle a more peacenik policy towards the Soviet Union, as it were, and limit nuclear confrontation, the Soviets themselves at this point actually took him for a fool. You know, it's right there in the document. Maybe not all of them, but Andropov, Gromyko, and Ustinov did. Of course, they died. Later on, I had a generational change, and maybe we had a, you know, realization in the Soviet leadership by the mid-1980s that maybe Kennan was right after all. Just maybe a couple more points that I wanted to mention in this connection. So this question of neurotic, you know, whether the Soviets were neurotic or not. It's interesting how, for example, in Mel Leffler's work, this is mentioned, you know, how Kennan was not justified in calling the Soviets neurotic or even taking this sort of a almost arrogant position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. We have to treat them kind of like a doctor would because they're crazy. Yeah, you see that in the long telegram. It's right there. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but you know, Mel says that, well, Kennan failed to account for the trauma of the Second World War, which Mark has just referred to in discussing Churchill's speech, etc. But, you know, my question in this connection is, okay, yeah, we can understand, we can try to understand that there was a huge, terrible tragedy, huge, terrible war. But does it make those views any less neurotic? I guess that's my question. You know what I'm trying to get to. In other words, if we take this road, there's a line there somewhere, and the question is, okay, neurotic, and then what? You know, if they're not neurotic, if they're reasonable, if they're justified, if, for example, Vladimir Olegovich was talking about, you know, real security interests of a great power, do those legitimate security interests, for example, include Soviet domination of Eastern Europe? I think that's the big question where we start trying to understand, you know, are those claims actually justified or not? You know, that's the problem that I find also struggling with, because you look at it from the kind of a great power perspective, say, well, yeah, you can make an argument, and anyway there was the, you know, the Second World War, and anyway Russia was invaded so many times through the Polish corridor, etc. But does it mean that I can justify Soviet domination of Eastern Europe? As a historian, I find it very difficult to do that. Again, it comes back to this moral anguish. How do you deal with this kind of regime? How do you deal with this kind of situation? I have not resolved it for myself. That's the problem. There's also another question that is kind of related to that, and that is we can never really get into Stalin's head. That's a problem. We can try to speak to his ghost. Comrade Stalin, tell us, you know, what were you really thinking? Because you could say, well, Stalin actually had limited aims, or you could argue that Stalin had limited aims because he was limited by containment, therefore he had limited aims. But if you put him in a different situation, maybe he would even push further. And this is where this cannot be answered. Kennan would say, yeah, it was, you know, he would just continue expanding unless contained, and we cannot actually put a counterfactual in place and say, well, what if it was not contained? Maybe he would stop on his own. Would he stop on his own? The costs are too high, right, to find out whether he would or not. And that's the difficult situation that policymakers in the United States found themselves in back in the late 1940s. Now, final point from me, and that is this question of the sources of Soviet conduct. This is a very broad issue. And I when I was rereading again, like all the other panelists, I was rereading the Long Telegram today. I was thinking about this whole question of Soviet, how Kennan talks about Soviet insecurity, how the Russians are exposed on that plain, the fierce nomadic people were terrorizing them throughout history, and how that made them particularly insecure. And I thought, well, actually, this is rubbish. This is rubbish for the following reason. Actually, a feeling of insecurity is a fundamental human feeling, and it extends beyond humans to our ape ancestors living in the jungle. We all know that everybody had insecurity even then. So if you take this position, and if you argue from that position, then you come to this idea that actually insecurity is a normal condition for a great power, which brings me to this point, which I find very difficult to square. And that is, could you argue that Soviet foreign policy was basically motivated primarily by considerations of realism, sort of on the, instead of Marx, you would have Thucydides, the strong exact what they can and the weak grant what they must. So the Soviets had to accumulate their military power, et cetera, et cetera. Did Marxism have anything to do with this? And I don't know what the answer is, but if you look at the long durée of Soviet and Russian conduct into the present day, you might argue that to really understand what is happening here, you really need to look at Russia as actually Vladimir Olegovich was talking about, as a great power, as a power that's trying to pursue its interests, and that Marxism per se had really very little to do with this. That's why I think Kennan's Long Telegram is still relevant to a certain extent today, not because Russia was, not because Russia was particularly aggressive or something, but because all great powers act in the same way. So this is a very realist kind of take. I think actually Kennan would agree with that. I think Kennan was fundamentally a realist. And in fact, when he does talk about ideology in the Long Telegram, it seems that he basically explains it away as some sort of a rationalization or a justification of the existing regime and its absolute determination to maintain political power in the country. You can see it in the program. Right. I think I will leave it at on this note.
Okay, thank you, Sergey. You like everyone else have raised some great questions. I would just point out one thing on the question of the impossibility of knowing how far Stalin would go if he were not contained. Of course, this is a time when everybody is influenced by the recent memory of Hitler and the failure of appeasement. And one thing that's striking about the telegram that hasn't been mentioned so far, is that Kennan really completely disputes any analogy between Hitler and Stalin in terms of Stalin being more pragmatic, more willing to pull back, if the knife hits steel, to pull back, and that therefore war is not inevitable. And, this is absolutely a crucial point that he makes. And, he does allow for the eventual mellowing of Soviet power and even the breakup. But one thing that's striking is you mentioned Mel Leffler. And in A Preponderance of Power, published in 1992, even though Mel had been a critic from the left, roughly speaking, of John Gaddis, Mel acknowledged that containment was probably prudent. Prudent was the word that was used to deal with the Soviets. And I remember Vlad Zubak came to my history class one time and kind of said, grudgingly, perhaps containment was prudent, just given the uncertainty of how far Stalin would go. But on the other hand, and this is one thing I'd like to put on the table for all of you, the most important recent book on Cold War origins is Norman Neymark's Stalin and the Fate of Europe. And Neymark from Stanford University argues from a series of case studies, including Bornholm, which actually shows up in the long telegram, I was surprised to see, that Stalin was actually, at least tactically, more pragmatic, realistic, even flexible than is often portrayed in historical works on Cold War origins. Does that at all influence your view as to whether Kennan was too stark in rejecting negotiations as being something to pursue with the Soviets? In other words, was some form of Finlandization of Central and Eastern Europe plausible in the early Cold War, or was that simply something that could only work for Finland itself? Anyone care to comment on that? And maybe we should go back to Vladimir.
Yes, on your last point, Jim, I think it's a matter of degree. The cases which Norman is putting forward are not essential from the point of view of Stalin's main points of agenda. I mean, on Poland, there could have been no compromise on Poland. Almost the same thing goes for Romania and Hungary, which had old scores with Russia and had to be made friendly by rather violent means, by Sovietization. Finland and Austria and Bornholm were in different categories. But in Austria, it took almost 10 years, right, to finally to withdraw the Soviet forces from there. And Finland was taken care of. I think it was an exception caused by the Finns themselves, but the way how skillfully they handled the Soviet side and how considerate they were to Soviet concerns about security. And after all, the security demands were met by Finns, right? That was the price they paid for the domestic autonomy. So I think it all, yes, Stalin was realistic in adjusting and yielding at certain points. Take this Iran or Turkey crisis. He always backed down in the end because he didn't take too high a risk. And in this sense, he was realistic. So his prudence saved him from the consequences of his own mistakes, right? Because initially he would not be, of course, against taking the northern Iran as a part of the Soviet Union or building bases in the Straits. But he yielded to the superior force, which exactly what Kennan was saying in his long telegram. That's the difference between Stalin and Hitler, because Stalin knows where to stop. Stalin doesn't go into high risk, into the gambles, essentially. So that would be but I want to leave some time for my colleagues.
Vladislav, you had two fingers up?
Only a reply to what Vladimir has just said, but this is why I mentioned, Mark is right, Stalin was mentioned, but Stalin was decentered, dissolved in the whole picture of the threat. So, and maybe because of this, because had Stalin been central, it would have been impossible to deny what Churchill admitted. There's a specific tyrant ruling the country. He is awfully pragmatic. He's not Hitler. He yields to power. He retreats. Leaving all the morality aside, we can negotiate with him and bargain with him. And this is exactly what is missing from the long telegram, and later on missing, I think, from the sources of Soviet conduct.
Yeah, although ironically, at the policy planning staff, he does sort of move a little bit in this direction because he supports negotiating unified neutral Germany, and loses that argument. Kennan always is contradicting himself.
Also, one of the versions, wrong one, as we know, was that Kennan wrote his telegram to tell the Treasury people why Stalin refused to accept the membership in the IMF and the Bretton Woods system as a whole.
Bank, yes,
it's the wrong one. But actually, we know from various studies that Stalin did not reject it. He let the deadline passed, but there was an opportunity for the Soviet Union of sort of looking at how things would develop in the first months of 1946 to participate in the Bretton Woods. And had the United States not shifted from the paradigm, let's change Soviet behavior through trade and money, to the paradigm, no, you cannot deal with them at all, who knows? There was a room for all kinds of possibilities.
Yeah, although conversely, in 1946, the Soviets seem absolutely uninterested in any kind of compromise on the international control of atomic energy. I mean, between the Baruch Plan and the Gromyko Plan, there were feelers put out in New York, but I think Stalin had made the decision that the Soviets needed their own bomb, not to depend on American good graces.
Jim, you're just pointing to linkage. It's an old problem that
absolutely.
we discussed in the 70s.
Absolutely.
Americans like to link things. The Russians also. They were each to their own interest.
Let me just turn to Mark.
Just a quick word on containment. Before Kennan wrote his long telegram and X article, containment was already in effect. That is, with regard to Iran and Turkey. After Kennan wrote his long telegram and X article, not long after, Czechoslovakia fell to communism. The United States didn't contain it. China, the next year, fell to communism. The United States didn't contain it. And then when an organization was actually set up to try to implement containment, that is NATO, Kennan opposed it. So sometimes in talking about Kennan and containment, I think you need to look at where reality was rather than the way it has gotten portrayed in retrospect. Now, you can look at the long telegram and the X article and say they were recipes for containment. But what Kennan actually was doing was sometimes divergent from that. With regard to, and then when the Korean War broke out, and you could argue the U.S. response was putting into effect containment. Kennan's position on it was mostly determined by that he was back briefly, even though he had stepped down already the previous year as director of policy planning. He was back briefly and stayed on as a result of the Korean War. But even there, it wasn't Kennan who actually brought about that. So I would say, containment emerged mostly through the instincts of others in the Truman administration. And these documents gave them a kind of justification for it that probably would have happened anyway.
I agree, Mark. Svetlana and then Sergey.
Yes, quickly, to the point that Stalin is not present in the telegram, I kept thinking about it after Vlad said it, and it might be that one of the reasons that Stalin himself, it's a weakness, I think, of the telegram, that he is not specifically addressed, Stalin's role. But I think Kennan tries to set the Soviet system within the hundreds of years of the Russian system. And so he keeps talking about this traditional Russian sense of insecurity, this long historic legacy, this why Marxism specifically set roots in Russia, and the form of Marxism became this totalitarian form. So in a way, maybe, I think if we ask Kennan about why Stalin is not there, because he saw this telegram as applying to more than just the period now. And from here, I have a question that I was thinking about when I was reading all this material yesterday. So he believes that there is this traditional sense of insecurity, at least on the part of the Russian state, and sense of external threat, conspiratorial thinking. And then Gorbachev comes to power, and then they do things like, let Eastern Europe go without any threat of use of force. And people like Cherняev say, well, it really doesn't matter if Germany is in NATO, if Poland is in NATO, they will not attack us even if we disarm completely. So from the point of view of Kennan, he sees these people and he thinks, whoa, they must be a real aberration to what I saw as this Russian traditional sense of insecurity. But also he was aware that this may not last, and more nationalist people might come back to dominate Russian politics. And that is one of the, I think, the main reason that he opposed the expansion of NATO in the 90s, for which all the Russian analysts, of course, loved him to death.
Okay, let's finish with Sergey.
Just to follow, actually, I had a different point, but just to follow up on what Svetlana was saying about Cherняev, his quite famous memo to Gorbachev about why we should sort of give up Germany, mentions that essentially it is because the Soviet Union is a nuclear power, so its security does not depend on this buffer, of states. Like yeah, it's right there. So it's interesting that for Cherняev, this is how Cherняev interpreted security, which may actually be a valid way of thinking about it. It's about, but one other point that I was just going to mention, going back to the origins of containment. From the Soviet perspective, and so from Stalin's perspective, containment certainly started earlier because, as of course Vladimir Olegovich and will know, because he was the pioneer who actually opened up research on this during the London Conference of Foreign Ministers. Stalin felt that he was real, and Stalin was not there, but Molotov was there, but Stalin felt that he was really pushed on against, in particular in relation to the American decision not to recognize Bulgaria and Romania. How could this be? This was in the Soviet sphere of influence. What's going on? The Americans are obviously trying to do some kind of tricky deal here, or trying to push the Soviet Union out of its rightful sphere of interest. I would even say that it started even earlier, and that is in August 1945, when Stalin decided to land forces on Hokkaido and flag this up for Truman, say, oh, by the way, we want to occupy Hokkaido. Truman said, no, thanks, but no, do not do that. And Stalin backed off. Clearly in his mind, this was a case of containment, even though it was not articulated in those terms.
Okay, we could easily continue this conversation until the 75th anniversary of the X article in a year and a half, but we have gone for an hour. I would like to thank you all for these fascinating comments. And I'd also like to thank Christian Osterman and the Wilson Center and Peter Bierstecker for organizing this and giving us a chance to get together and talk. So with that, thank you all very much, and we'll see you later.